Welcome to the You Can Learn Photography podcast, where we introduce photographers from Canada, not just the well-known, but the everyday hobbyist through to the professional who have a passion for photography and want to share their knowledge. We're going to get to know who they are, what they care about. We'll take a look at some of their work, find out what they're currently doing, and what they wish they would have known in the beginning. All right, let's jump into it. Welcome to episode 21 of the You Can Learn Photography podcast with your host, Trevor Haywalt. In this episode, we'll be talking to Wayne Simpson, a professional photographer, author, and educator currently based in Elora, Ontario. We'll get to know Wayne, talking about his start in landscape photography around the Rockies, while working as a graphic designer photographer in a fast-paced job that essentially transformed Wayne into becoming a commercial photographer. We then talk about his transition into his own portrait photography business, while at the same time starting a family and relocating from Alberta to Ontario. Wayne reveals the reality of making a living as a full-time photographer, which required making family-combined financial decisions to allow him to follow his passion for portrait photography while creating images for his first book, Resilient. Wayne describes how the idea came about for his book and how he connected with his publisher through social media, noting the importance of not only a great photograph, but the backstory as well, including the publication process, getting the project completed, which resulted in speaking engagements, appearances, and signing sessions. With his recent gallery project, we discussed the work involved as well as how the timing of being interviewed by Matt Galloway of CBC The Current and mention of his half-Indigenous Ojibwe heritage played a role in helping to define and develop his exhibit, with the first showing in the fall of 2023 at the Elora Centre for the Arts, which showcased Indigenous portraits from the community he was born in, as well as a presentation of his short film. So come and join us as we get to know Wayne on this information-packed episode, while on your walk, drive, or just sit back in your comfy chair while listening to our conversation. Wayne, we briefly met at your co-character workshop with Dave Brosha in October 2023 at Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, and we're so glad you're able to be here on the podcast today. Through our discussion, we're going to get to know you better by looking at some of your work, discuss some of your most memorable projects, what you've been recently up to, such as your exhibit at the Elora Centre for the Arts, and discuss how your personal life has led you to your current style of portrait photography. You're a portrait, landscape, commercial photographer, speaker, and author with your successful first book titled Resilient. You're also a mentor and workshop leader, co-leader, with well-known photographers Dave Brosha and Paul Ziska. You're not new to being interviewed, including about your landscape photography, and since the release of your first book in 2021, resulting in being interviewed by many, including Adorama TV Through the Lens, The Social Hour, CBC Ottawa, The Camera Store TV, and Rising Laterally podcast, as well as a short documentary with Sigma Canada. You have an online presence through your website and social media, but for the folks out there who don't know you yet that will be listening to this podcast, Wayne, who are you?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I appreciate this. Who am I? Well, first and foremost, I'm a father to two beautiful girls. I guess you'd say I'm, like all of us, I'm a student of photography. I never have claimed to know it all. I don't think I ever will know it all. And that's the best part of it. That's what excites me, I mean, I started out as a graphic designer, actually. What led me to photography eventually was needing images for my work. And this was back before I could ever afford a digital SLR camera. It was, I used a film camera that I bought secondhand. And I'd basically take the pictures I needed for the assignment in school and get them developed, scan them, use them in my work. So that's kind of my introduction.
Right.
Eventually, a couple of years later, I ended up moving out to Calgary. While I was out there, the mountains Everybody says how they just take your breath away and,
Right.
and they're just so amazing, and it's absolutely true. That's what inspired me to
Right.
really learn how to use a camera, to do my best to actually capture what I was seeing and do it some sort of justice. So that was the
Right.
beginning.
So out in Calgary, you're a landscape photographer. And what were you doing out there in Calgary from a work perspective?
My work as a graphic designer started out there. So I worked at a couple of
Okay.
different agencies, ad agencies, and then eventually for the head office of Husky Oil.
Okay.
Yeah, that job, as good as it was, it started to squash me creatively. That's when I started doing
Okay.
work on the weekends. I'd go out and take landscape photos. Eventually started taking photographs of people because I learned that it's very hard to make a living as a landscape photographer. Some amazing photographers out there, like Paul Ziska,
Right.
for example, can do it really well. I found it very difficult. That's when I started photographing people doing
Right.
weddings, family portraits, things like that, and eventually phasing out the whole husky job.
Right. So changing over from landscape type photography and getting into portrait photography from a skills perspective, how did that develop?
Looking back on it, it's actually kind of comical. I was afraid of people. My experience
Okay.
working for Husky did me a lot of good, actually. I was hired as a graphic designer, but they wanted me to have an interest in photography. I
Okay.
didn't know what that meant at that time. What it meant was they were going to give me a point and shoot camera, basically, and send me out wherever the CEO of the company went
Okay.
and to photograph him and record, all the golden handshakes and speaking engagements and all these different things.
Right.
I had to learn very, very fast under a lot of
Right.
pressure.
With not a great camera, obviously.
Exactly. I ended up finding the limits of the equipment they gave me,
Right.
and I went out and bought my own to show them what could be done with a better equipment.
Right.
So at that point, I bought, I think it was a Nikon D70 and an 80 to 200 lens, and I believe it was like a 17 to 55 or something like that.
Okay.
So I took my own equipment to do their jobs, and eventually they saw the value in it and they started investing in professional equipment.
Right.
From there on in, my work just kept getting better. I kept learning faster. They just ultimately trusted me with it all.
Right.
And my job became about, I'd say, 80% photography and 20% graphic design at that
Right.
point. I did all the in house portraits and things for the upper management.
Right.
Followed the CEO around for all the events. I photographed the different facilities, the workers at the facilities, did aerial stuff from choppers. It was all an amazing learning experience under a lot of pressure.
Right.
I literally had to make a booklet of contact sheets after everything I shot
Right.
and bring it up to the CEO.
Yeah. So you jumped from junior graphic designer right into being a commercial photographer.
Pretty much, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Being a landscape photographer, whether that was the early phase of your photography or whether you had spent a fair bit of time in landscape photographer learning light. Now the portrait commercial type photography, learning light or trying to understand light in difficult environments.
Yes. And I mean, that was hard enough. But actually starting to get more comfortable with people was really, I guess, what I was trying to get. That was the key for me, being
Right.
forced out of my comfort zone over and over again, and to deal with different lighting conditions. That really prepared me for things like weddings and family portraits.
Right.
So my work in those genres really started out with little tiny people in a landscape,
Right.
and I would throw a little bit of light at them just to try and make them pop.
Right.
And I mean, they might as well have been landscape photos, really.
Right.
So as time went on, I got more and more comfortable and I started getting closer and closer and closer to the people,
Right.
to the point where now I literally have to be careful sometimes that I'm not touching my subject nose with my lens. I get right in there.
So like in that case, like using 35 millimeters probably for some of your portraits.
Well, I don't go quite Well, I shouldn't say I don't go quite that wide. I do sometimes, but
Right.
sometimes I'll forget what lens I have on in the moment and I'll be right in there and I have to double check I'm not going to run into them, you know?
Right. So once you kind of left the oil industry and you're now shooting weddings and probably event photography too and portraits, how did that all go and where did that start to take you in relationship to where you are now?
Really, the weddings were the first thing to sort of start taking off. I booked minimal weddings in the beginning
Right.
and then eventually had realized I was getting too busy, so I had to phase out my husky job. Then I was full time. The weddings, I really did enjoy them for the first while. As challenging as they are very rewarding as well. But there came a point, eventually, my wife and I moved from Calgary back to Ontario, where we're both from.
Okay.
The whole reason being that we were wanting to start a family and we wanted to be closer to our own families.
Ah,
So before leaving Calgary, I had to switch my whole business and actually start marketing to an Ontario audience, which I really didn't know many people. I didn't have any connections.
right.
And in that first year, before we even left Calgary, I had booked 16 or 19, I think it was 19 weddings
Oh my
from a
God.
distance. And so as soon as we got to Ontario, it was full on.
Wow.
So that went well for a while. I think we ended up doing, my wife and I shot together. She's not a photographer, she's an accountant, but she was nice enough to help me out to save costs of hiring an assistant.
Right.
So we together did, it was 80 or 90 weddings and eventually reached a point where our first daughter was born. And it was really, really difficult because my wife was breastfeeding at the time and
Okay.
we would be gone all day, the grandparents watching our little girl. And my wife would leave something for the baby to eat. But then there came a time where we needed more. So the grandparents would actually have to meet us at the reception venue. My wife would have to go out and feed the baby, run back in to help me. And it just got to be too much.
Right.
And it wasn't the same when we phased my wife out of it and started hiring assistants. I didn't enjoy it anymore.
Right.
And so that was around the time, I guess, that I really started to get into workshops and speaking engagements and things like that.
Right.
A lot of that, I have to say, is because of Dave Brosha, who you've interviewed.
Right.
Dave really pushed me to get out of my comfort zone. He gave me my first speaking engagement that really kickstarted a whole different realm of my career.
Right.
That got me into running workshops, which now are actually in partnership with Dave most of the time. I do my own at
Right.
times.
Yes.
Yeah, a lot of speaking engagements, something I never ever thought I'd do.
Right. So financially, working as a full-time photographer, we know that in today's environment and even a number of years back, it wasn't that easy to make a full-time employment being a photographer. So, your weddings, when you stop doing weddings and then move into like just portraiture, it's not the same kind of income.
No. Well, I should clarify actually. My journey was, I think, quite different than a lot of people's.
Okay.
There was a time when basically my wife was on maternity leave and we had a decent income coming in from her job.
Right.
She was able to take care of our daughter. And together we made the decision that if I was going to try a different direction, that was the time.
Okay.
And so what I decided to do was to really pour myself into the type of portraiture that you see now that I'm doing.
Right.
And what that meant was really there would be kind of a period of time where I wouldn't make much money.
Right.
And so what I really started to do was photograph the people that really appealed to me, not even for like a paid job, just the kind of work that I wanted to do that just spoke to me. And so I literally started noticing people as I would travel or as I would just be around my own hometown. And I would notice people and I would ask them if I could photograph them. And the idea being that I would photograph them in a way that really spoke to me and I would create the work that I really loved. And with the hopes of other people seeing that work and wanting to learn how to do the same.
Okay.
That's where the ball started rolling, where people wanted to learn.
Right.
I started teaching and workshops were born basically.
So you talk about yourself initially being more of an introvert person And while you were working out in Calgary as a graphic artist photographer, you were learning how to talk and work with people. Then you move into shooting weddings where you're now interacting more to make your subjects feel comfortable to get good photographs. Now you're starting to work with different people, such as the homeless, who can be very different in their character and their demeanor. So you're presenting yourself with good intentions, a little more caring, and want to start working with unique subjects. How difficult was it initially to get a discussion going for them to understand and be comfortable with what you were trying to do?
Yeah, I actually remember the exact moment where things changed for me. And it was a man named Glenn Hallman who has since passed away. He is in my book. I believe he might be the first story in my book. Glenn, when I met him, it was a funny thing because before Glenn, whenever I would see somebody on the streets, I would do what a lot of us do, which is purposely look the other way or just not engage and have I'll admit it, I had kind of negative thoughts a lot of times about these people
Right.
and made a lot of assumptions. With Glenn, it wasn't even a conscious thing that I did. I just basically saw this man that I found to be really interesting looking. I saw him he was in a Tim Hortons just sitting at a table by himself.
Right.
I didn't know he was homeless at the time. He looked a little rough, but
Right.
I didn't think he was homeless. It wasn't until I actually got to know him that I really started to appreciate him more. And something clicked to not let myself assume that a person on the streets is a bad person or somebody that's got addictions or,
Right.
all the assumptions we make. Glenn didn't drink. He didn't do drugs. He was 88 years old when I met him. He was actually sleeping in the woods on the outskirts of Banff. He was just trying to live his life.
Okay.
And as I got to know him, I really started to see something different than I expected. And I think the more I got to know him, the more that really stuck with me. And it still does to this day. And I don't know how many years ago now that I photographed him, but
Right.
it was a life changing thing to actually engage with this man and learn about him and throw away these assumptions that I used to make.
Right.
I don't know if I just answered your question there or not.
Yeah, I think so. And the more you got used to this, the easier it would be to approach people.
Yeah, and I found myself genuinely interested in people more.
Right.
Whereas before I would kind of keep to myself and I would know certain parts of people's stories because of what I heard about them.
Right.
But what I've found, especially throughout working on my book, is that you might think you know something about people, but until you sit down with that person, have a real conversation, and learn about them, you really don't know about them.
Right.
And so that was a big deal for me.
So how did you know when you started taking these types of photographs that they were going to work into being a different kind of portrait? And how did that first time you photographed someone, how much different do the portraits, your initial portraits look compared to how your portraits look now?
That's a good question. They really don't look a lot different, to be honest.
Okay.
I think maybe I've finessed some of my lighting a little bit more and I pay attention to some things I didn't before, but overall, the aesthetic's pretty similar.
Cool.
I remember the first person that I actually photographed in the style that you see now, and his name was Grizz.
Okay.
He's also passed on now. I photographed him out near Cochrane, Alberta. And it was the first person, again, thanks to Dave Brosha, he encouraged me to actually approach people that I found interesting and do personal work for the purpose of growth and fulfilling myself as an artist. So Grizz was the first person that I actually did that with. And literally in one shoot, I went from photographing families or wedding couples or whatever as little people in a big scene
Right.
with a bit of light on them to an actual intimate portrait of somebody that shows their face, has interesting light. And the whole reason that that happened was because I gave myself permission to experiment and play and not worry about money.
Right.
It was all for the joy of shooting.
Right.
And I still remember when I got my lights at a certain angle and then I took the shot and I looked on the back of the camera, I thought, this is it. This is the type of stuff that I mean, it was similar to other photographers' work that I've been inspired by. Joey Lawrence is one of them, Joel Grimes,
Right.
Dave Brosha, of course. But it was especially close, I think, to the aesthetic of Joey Lawrence. And not that I would compare myself to him, he's a fantastic photographer, but the aesthetic I was really drawn to. I feel like that was the moment that I really sort of honed in on what made me happy. And to be totally honest, for a while I tried to emulate what he was doing. And of course I couldn't.
Right.
I think we all know as photographers, you might try to replicate what someone else does, but
Yeah.
you can never really replicate it. And I think that's a good thing.
Yes.
I basically came out with my own style at the end of the day because I failed to copy someone else's.
Right.
So
We all have to start somewhere.
exactly.
And in a lot of cases, we know what we like, and that's what we gravitate to.
Yep.
So how long did it take between that first photograph to getting together a portfolio of images that now you're thinking about a book? And how difficult was it to shrink that portfolio down for the content of your book?
As far as time period goes, I haven't thought about this before. I would say it was a good 5 years before I had a decent portfolio that I was proud to show.
Okay.
The whole book thing actually happened. I didn't realize it, but my publisher, Rocky Mountain Books, had actually been following my work, and I didn't know that at the time.
Wow.
So what I was doing was I would do a shoot, I would share up a portrait I was proud of and give a little backstory about the person.
Right.
And they started to take notice.
Oh, cool.
So before I even had, I would say, even a quarter of the work needed for a book, they already knew what I was about and the kind of work I did. So it kind of kept going from there. As far as narrowing down the work, that wasn't hard at all because I didn't have much more.
Okay.
To be totally honest, I tend to be very particular when I'm shooting. And if I don't come out of a shoot with an image that I'm really proud of, I'll schedule another shoot with them.
Right.
And I'll make sure I get something.
Right.
And so the only ones that might not have been included would have been ones where people were not comfortable enough to share their stories.
Right.
Or maybe a story was just too intense to really write about.
Right.
Things like that.
If you don't have a model release when you go initially take their photo, when you want to put a book together like this, you need to go back and contact these people and get their buy-in.
Yeah, that's exactly what I had to do. I had to go back on a lot of people and get releases. Yeah.
Right. So your first book that you put together that we've just been talking about is called Resilient, and it's out there for purchase on Amazon. And I just wanted to point out that it's a different book. Most photo books that you look at are basically, when you open the book, you get some information at the front, and then it's page after page of photographs. But your book it's just totally different. It's a book of portraits of interesting people that have an interesting story. And in amongst those few pages that you have for each person, you then tell the story of the person. And those stories are very impactful, hence the title of the book, Resilient. So the idea behind this and the idea behind the title, did you have the title initially and the idea of how you were going to put this together? Or as you were, over the few years that you were doing this, these stories would then have probably had a significant impact on you personally. How did you decide on not making this like a normal photo book? And how did you come up with, well, of course, it's not difficult, obviously, with the content to come up with the word resilient, but how did you put this all together and come up with this thought?
It wasn't hard to come up with the idea. I really just kind of sat back and I spread out a whole bunch of my images and sat there thinking for a while, like, what is the common denominator here? What do all these images have in common? And it was a pretty clear answer that, they were all people that have been through some intense things, or even if I didn't know what they had been through, you could see it.
Right.
That was really kind of the thing that sparked me thinking in that direction. And I can't actually take credit for the title. My friend Megan Ward, who's actually Paul Ziska's wife,
Okay.
she's the one that came up with the title Resilient. And I thought it was just brilliant.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you get into thinking about publishing a book, you've got this body of material put together and you're starting to work with a publisher. What you're indicating is the publisher contacted you as opposed to you contacting the publisher. How does the process work from the perspective of getting this book together? I mean, you're a graphic designer yourself. Do you put the book together the way you want, or does the publisher put the book together the way they want? How many copies are you going to get printed of this book? And what are the logistics in, getting these out and getting them sold and doing signing dates and, getting out there, signing books for people and so on? Let's wrap a small story around that.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, Rocky Mountain Books had been following my work for a bit, and I didn't realize that a friend of mine brought that to my attention, that they knew about my work, and he had been chatting with them because he had already published with them, and he knew that they had a slot open in their season for a book. So my friend suggested you might want to contact them and see if there's an opportunity there. So that's how I pursued it.
Oh, cool.
They didn't actually reach directly out to me, but I was told about an opportunity, and so I went forward with that.
Maybe you can talk about the differences between a publisher and self-publishing. Why you decided to go with a publisher as opposed to self-publishing a book.
Yeah, I had people suggest to me before that it might be a good plan to do a book. And I had toyed with the idea briefly of self-publishing, but what I realized is that would mean that I have to put a whole bunch of money up front.
Right.
To be able to actually produce the book, and I'd have to find, a designer, an editor, and all the rest of it. So when this opportunity came up, I jumped on it.
Right.
And so going back to your first question there, the great thing about working with a publisher is, they've done it lots of times. They know how to guide you through it, and they've got processes and systems in place. So for me, basically, they gave me a little bit of guidance, but not too much, which was great,
Right.
because the book wouldn't have been what it is had they given me too much guidance.
Right.
They gave me some subtle suggestions, like the stories. It was suggested that they be kept at about 500 words or less.
Okay.
I tried, but some of them were way more than that, probably 5 times that.
Right.
But when there's a story that you just can't truncate into 500 words, I didn't want to do a disservice to the story and to that person, so that's what I did. But yeah, they walked me through the whole process. They gave me certain guidelines as far as, what they needed by certain dates and things like that.
Right.
And as it happened, the window that I had available to me for publishing, it was only 8 months away from when I signed the contract.
Wow.
And that scared me, but I thought, okay, I don't want to miss this opportunity. I'm going to go for it.
Right.
And so away we went. And I think I was at about the 7th month or so, and I didn't quite feel comfortable with where I was at. So I sent the publisher a rough manuscript of what I had to that point. And I asked their opinion. I said, do you think we're close, or do you think I need more time? And he said, I like what you've got, but I think it would be much stronger if you had more time. And the way it works is, basically it wasn't like, oh, we'll give you a couple months more. It needed to be an entire year because of just the way their scheduling works.
Right.
So once I had another year to play with, that's where things took off for me. That's where the most impactful stories came in. I included my own mother's story, and which in essence is my story. And it just became so much deeper as I went that direction.
Right. So getting out to promote your book and signing your book, how did that all work?
I worked with the publisher to sort of figure out what would make the most sense logistically, where I would do signings and things like that. They kind of have a list of their usual contacts there
Okay.
where they'll try to promote books and different areas where signings can happen. So they
Right.
try to help in that respect, but then they also encourage the author to, do their part and contribute as well.
Right.
The one thing I never ever expected myself to do, but turned out to be an amazing experience, was speaking at the Saskatchewan Festival of Words.
Okay.
So I basically went and did book readings over, I think it was 3 or 4 days,
Okay.
which I don't think I've ever said this publicly, but I'm going to say it anyway. I am one of those people that has a lot of trouble sitting down and reading a book,
Right.
actually finishing a book. So here I was invited to go and speak and do readings of my book with like legitimate, amazing authors over 4 days. And at that point, I had never read a complete book in my life.
Oh, wow.
And I thought, what's the worst that could happen? I'll crash and burn. Nobody knows me there. So I did it. And it ended up being a really amazing experience.
Wow.
Yeah. Thankfully, I had some images to lean on. So where other authors would do amazing readings with no visuals,
Right.
I had my visuals and I would do pretty mediocre readings. But then I also, in an effort to make it even a little more impactful, I had the audio from interviews from a lot of my subjects.
Oh, cool.
So what I did was I was able to extract some of those bits of audio with their permission and share those kind of within my talks. So
Wow.
it went over really, really well.
So it's a little more than just a reading. It was almost like an opening night talk.
Yeah.
Or a artist talk at an exhibit.
Yeah, exactly. And for anybody out there that's considering doing something like that and they're afraid because they've never done a book reading at one of these things, I would encourage them to do it because the people were incredibly supportive. People that have been there numerous times totally embraced me and helped me and
Right.
cheered me on. And at the end of the day, I was super proud. So yeah, it was a good experience.
Right. So again, just another little plug for your book. Anyone interested in out purchasing this book and reading some amazing stories, it's a book, Resilient, by Wayne Simpson. And that's available. Probably the easiest location is on Amazon, where I purchased one for my wife for Christmas. So it's an awesome book. So let's maybe talk about some of your recent stuff you've been up to at the Elora Art Museum there. Can you tell us about that exhibit and what all went into that?
Yeah, so it's actually the Elora Center for the Arts, it's called. The way this came about was they heard my interview on CBC with Matt Galloway on The Current. And in that interview, I mentioned that I was half Indigenous, Ojibwe. And they didn't know that.
Okay.
And they happened to just have a grant opportunity come across, and it was specifically for an Indigenous artist. And they immediately thought of me.
Oh, wow.
So they helped me apply for the grant and everything. And I would say we waited probably 6 or 7 months not knowing if it was going to happen. I basically had written the whole thing off in my mind. I didn't expect to get it. And at that point, my mom had become quite ill. She had COPD, and
Okay.
she was in hospice for 5 days. And the day that she passed away, I literally said goodbye to my mom, and I walked out of the room she was in into the lobby, and my phone rang. And it was Molly from the Center for the Arts, and she said, "You got the grant."
Oh, wow.
And the whole premise of the project was to go back to the reserve over multiple visits, because it's about 3 hours from where I live, to go back to this reserve that I didn't grow up in, but was a part of, and learn about my heritage. And my mom always wanted me to be more in touch with my Indigenous roots because it comes from my mom's side. And so that was the premise of the whole project.
Right. So the images that you had at the exhibit, what images did you present?
So what I basically did was, for the grant itself, what I committed to creating was a body of work in the form of portraits. So I was going to fill the gallery with portraits, but for some reason, I also thought it'd be a great idea to make a 10-minute film, which
Okay.
was just as much work, if not more.
Right.
So that was really scary that I'd committed to that and now had to do it. But I had roughly a year to accomplish this. And so I went, and I mean, I have family there and everything, but I didn't know them very well. So this was an opportunity for me to go back and get to know them and to photograph them and to keep digging deeper and getting to know more people in the community that I would have never met otherwise.
Right.
As a kid, real quick story here. I lived with my mom till I was about 7. And at that point, she had asked or had told me that my dad was going to come and pick me up. I'd never met my dad before. He was going to come pick me up. I was going to visit him for 2 weeks. The reality of it was, it wasn't meant to be 2 weeks. It was the rest of my childhood. So without saying goodbye to my brothers or anything like that, I basically walked out the door, didn't see my brothers again until my adult life. And I saw my mom probably every 2 or 3 weeks after that. My mom would have to drive 3-4 hours to get me on a weekend, bring me to the reserve. We would basically stay at her house, so I didn't really meet many people or see much.
Right.
And then she'd bring me back to my dad. The whole reason she did this is because I was having trouble being a white-looking kid on the reserve.
Right.
And it wasn't going well for me. And I also didn't have a father figure in my life. So she wanted me to have those things. And that's how she did it.
Right.
So where the heck was I just going with that?
You were tying this into getting back to your community and
Mm.
getting to know the people in the community so that you could take some portraits for your showing at the gallery.
So going back and actually getting to know people was a big deal for me because as an adult, when I would drive to the reserve to visit my mom when she was still with us, I would basically get off the highway and drive onto the reserve, and I would immediately just feel tense. I didn't feel like I belonged.
Yeah.
I really didn't feel welcome. It wasn't because of anything anybody there did. I just didn't feel welcome.
Right.
And this whole process of getting to know people, and a lot of it was getting to know them for the first time
Right.
through basically meeting them somewhere and photographing them. And as I'm
Right.
shooting, I'm talking and asking questions. And it was, for me at least, it was a comfortable way to meet people.
Right.
Before this project, I was afraid to even cross the road from my mom's house and knock on a door.
Right.
It just scared me. I thought it was dangerous. Now, I've done 2 sweat lodges on the reserve. I've made lots of new friends. I will be taking the exhibit there for them to see in the community center and share the film and everything with them.
Wow.
I've learned of people that my mom was very close with, and I didn't realize it, so I've learned more about my mom. It just goes on and on. I've been to, before when I would go to a powwow there, I wouldn't dare leave the bleachers where the general public would sit because I was just scared.
Right.
And this past summer when I went, I found myself just freely wandering around and feeling totally at home. And I didn't even realize it till I stopped and thought about it. So
Right.
it's a big deal. I've gone from feeling incomplete to now feeling like I know who I am and feeling much better.
Seems to me as feeling like an outcast.
Yeah.
And feeling that you had identified yourself as not being welcomed.
Yeah.
And to be able to go back there, whether that took place for them over time or took place for you over time, there was some growth there probably on both sides. These are real people. I shouldn't be afraid. And then growth on their side saying, hey, this guy was part of our community. We should welcome him.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, I should point out, kids can be incredibly cruel.
Right.
Especially when they gang up on one kid.
Yeah.
And so those were the experiences I remembered. And I mean, we were all just kids. People change.
Racial bullying is a major, major thing that goes on every day.
Yep.
And kids can be pretty bad and have a lasting effect on people that they don't even realize until sometime later in your life.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that was obviously a successful showing at Elora. Taking this back to your home community, that would be amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And now you're dipping your feet into filmmaking. I saw on YouTube a short film about your thoughts and experiences during COVID. The other short film that I thought was done really interesting is in association with Sigma Canada. And of course, the film that you're talking about with your recent exhibit in Elora, I'm sure that'll eventually be released to the public after you go home to show that to your community. So it'll be very interesting for people to see that short film.
I've shared that most recent one with a few people, but and in closed community groups kind of thing. But I'm holding it a little bit tight yet because I don't know if or which galleries might take the exhibit, and I don't think they'll want it to be totally out there.
Yeah, it needs to be new.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about some of your techniques that you use to approach people for the subjects that you want to photograph, to make them comfortable with you and to generate a relationship. And also for photographers to understand that they may or may not find themselves in a situation that they're comfortable with.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Okay, I'll start with how I would approach someone. So first and foremost, something that really put my mind at ease is, I can't even remember who it was that told me this, but one of the people I approached, they said, believe it or not, you're not the first person that's approached me and asked to photograph me. And that really stuck in my head that more often than not, if you see somebody that really makes you do a double take and is very visually interesting, there's a pretty good chance they've been approached before. So it's not like you're always going to be going in and surprising a person. I mean, sometimes they've never heard it before, but a lot of times they have. So that puts my mind at ease when I'm approaching somebody. Really, I just try to be an equal person to them. It doesn't matter if it's a homeless person or a millionaire. It really doesn't matter to me what walk of life they come from. I just try to sort of bring myself to an equal spot and approach them as a fellow human. I don't try to be a holier than thou photographer or an artiste, I'm just a guy with a camera that's really interested in the person.
Exactly.
So, I mean, first I would approach them and basically point out why I'm approaching them after a bit of small talk.
Right.
I don't just go right up and ask to take their picture. I would find something in common to talk about, whether it's, it can be ridiculous, like the weather, or maybe they're walking a dog, ask them what kind of dog it is and talk about my dog, whatever.
Right.
And just kind of strike up a conversation and then eventually get to a point where I say, I'm actually a portrait photographer, at which point usually, well, more often than not, you'll kind of see them sort of roll their eyes and start to disengage.
Right.
And I immediately say, don't worry, I'm not trying to sell you anything. I noticed you and I think you have a really interesting look and certain character about you that I find really interesting. And that's the kind of work I love to do. Then I go on to explain that I don't do it for money. I explain exactly what's in it for them and what's in it for me so that they understand all that. They know there's nothing being hidden. So I'll tell them, I'll say, if you allow me to photograph you, I'm happy to share images with you. I'll give you a few prints, whatever ones you like. And what I get from it is that people see the work I'm creating, they enjoy it, they might want to learn how to do it. And that's how I make money from it, is where I teach people. And I just make sure that they're comfortable with me sharing the images online.
Right.
So that's the basics of it, really. I'll always have my phone with me with a bit of a portfolio on there so I can show them the type of work I do.
Right.
And a lot of times, as soon as they see the work on my phone, they'll understand why I've approached them. They'll see it.
Right. Not so easy if it's your first one, right?
Yeah.
But still, if your intentions are good and you represent yourself well.
There's a certain stage too where somebody that's just trying to get into it, it becomes something that, you've befriended this person and then you're working on something together with them knowing that you're just trying to improve, and you've taken an interest in them.
Right.
I think, I mean, any of us, if somebody asks you questions and wants to know about you and they show a genuine interest, it's hard not to like the person or to engage with them, you know?
Right.
And so that's kind of what I play off of.
Right. Do you start wanting to take their portrait at that time? Or do you say, well, let's arrange a time where we can get together at a location that you're comfortable with that we can do the photograph? Do you do it later or do you do it then?
I think I've only ever done it on the spot, I think once.
Okay.
Other than that, it's always been I approach them. Usually that's because I see them at the most random times and I don't have all my stuff with me.
Right.
You know, it'll be an opportunity in front of you and you don't want to miss it. So, I've found myself driving past somebody, turning around, driving past again, and then driving back again and parking somewhere so that I can walk and meet them on the sidewalk and strike up a conversation.
Right.
In one instance, locally here, there's a man that's on a scooter. He's got like a respiratory issue that he can't walk long distances, so he uses a scooter.
Right.
Those things are really fast.
Yeah.
It is hard to catch a person in those. Um, I tried probably for about 3 months to catch up with this man, and I finally caught up with him, and he's the nicest guy. So anyway, it can be challenging, but
Right.
I typically don't like to start the relationship off with any kind of pressure.
Right.
I kind of approach them, do my little spiel, and then I leave the ball in their court. I give them my contact information and hope that they'll call me.
Right.
If they're willing, I'll take their information as well, but a lot of times it's just me leaving mine with them.
Once you get to the point where you're taking a portrait, how important is the conversation with them to get the portrait you're looking for or to get something unique from the session? And what kind of conversation usually takes place? Are you probing them, for them to tell their story to you? Or do you take other types of approaches?
Sometimes I will probe a little bit, but I also recognize that a lot of times there's very sensitive issues at hand, like addictions or abuses or things like that.
Right.
So those things really have to be eased into a lot of times.
Right.
Yeah. As far as how to get emotion from them, I wish I was better at that, to be honest. A lot of times, a lot of my images, I think I just catch them in a moment.
Right.
It's not so much me getting an emotion from them, but more, it's sort of more like I ask them to look a certain way and there just happens to be something going on in their mind or,
Right.
yeah, I wish I could say I do this and that and I get that emotion, but it's not the truth.
Right. Every person will be different, right?
That being said, I also try to be ready because there have been instances. Leona Sky Grandmont, she's in my book. She is a survivor of human trafficking. There was a point when I was interviewing her and I had already done some portraits of her, but we were all still set up and still in the exact same situation. But she started talking again and I made sure I was ready. And at one point, she told me that in her home, she explained all the abuses and terrible things that had happened to her. And I could see her starting to tear up a little bit. And then she started explaining to me how her younger brother was in that same house. And she was so concerned with her own well being that she never thought that he might be going through the same thing. So
Right.
she basically started crying and saying how guilty she felt that she wasn't there to help him.
Right.
And in that moment, I got a very impactful close up shot of her.
Right.
So I think it's important to be ready for it.
Right.
For sure.
This is the part of the podcast where we showcase some of Wayne's images. For those of you following along, go to youcanlearnphotography.ca, click on podcasts, and go to episode 21 for Wayne Simpson. Then scroll down to the bottom of that blog post. You will see a gallery of images. Click on the first image of the Indigenous man, Ryan, sitting in front of a sweat lodge, and then you'll be able to follow along as we discuss his images. Okay, so let me just go in here now, and I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, so let's just take a look at some of your images here that we can discuss. So let's take a look at this guy here holding the antler, and let's have a little bit of discussion as to how this photo all came about.
His name's Ryan Joseph, and he's actually a relatively new friend to me.
Okay.
I explained how going back to the reserve and getting in touch with my roots, that I had made friends and I had done a couple of sweat lodges. Ryan here is, I guess, probably about the first person that I was introduced to from a family member and told that he is somebody that I could trust to learn more traditional knowledge from and to actually take part in a sweat with. So Ryan is actually a sweat lodge conductor,
Okay.
and he's had to earn that over years of basically apprenticing under somebody. I don't think he would call it apprenticing, but all of the items that he uses, which are placed in front of him in the image on this blanket, are all very specific things that are used in the sweat lodge ceremony. A lot of these things have been passed down to him, so they have a lot of meaning.
Wow.
For example, the antlers he's holding in a sweat lodge, the stones, or they referred to as grandfathers and grandmothers, the superheated stones that are in the fire outside of the lodge are then brought into the lodge, and they're basically put in this pit in the middle. And these antlers are used kind of like salad tongs to maneuver the rocks around and get them in the right place.
Okay.
So even those have specifically been handed down to him for that purpose.
Wow.
The lodge behind him is the actual lodge that I was a part of building. Now, this is just basically the frame of it.
Okay.
What happens is it gets covered with heavy canvas tarps so that you can't see one speck of light when you're in there.
Okay.
So literally when you're in there, all you see is glowing rocks in the center.
Wow.
And what I learned was that you can't actually photograph a sweat lodge when it's covered because it's considered to be like Mother Earth's womb.
Okay.
And it's a sacred space. And so once it's covered, not allowed to photograph it.
Okay.
Also, there's a leather pouch type thing that's in front of Ryan's right knee. There's actually a drum in there, which I also was not allowed to photograph because it's a sacred drum only to be used in that sweat lodge ceremony.
Okay.
And so it's not to be photographed either.
Oh.
So there were a lot of things that I had to learn along the way to be able to even make this portrait.
Yeah, learning all the intricacies of traditions complicates creating a photograph for sure.
Yeah, if I could keep going if we had another hour to talk about this image, but but I'm not going to.
Wow. All right, let's move on to the next one. Here we go. One of your portraits, I believe this guy is in your book.
Yes, I'm pretty sure all of these are, if I remember right, which ones I sent to you. So this man's name is Frank Kuyak, and Frank was the last remaining fishing guide in Algonquin Park, and he did it for, I believe, 70-something years. I think it was 75 years. Since he was 8 years old, he's guided people.
Okay.
And I was lucky enough to go and meet him and work with Frank to do the Sigma video, which you mentioned earlier. That was shot by Kyle McDougall, a good friend of mine. He did an amazing job on that.
Okay.
And that was shot as a promo for Sigma lenses, and it was me photographing Frank here. So Frank, he's basically famous around Algonquin Park. He has canoes around every bend and every lake, it seems. His canoes were always equipped with oars because he liked to row his canoe because he would have a client with him, right? So he would just kind of cruise along rowing them.
Okay.
In his mid 40s, so about my age, he really struggled with alcoholism and thankfully was able to turn his life around. He started losing clients and family members, and just family life was not great with his alcoholism going on. And he was able to totally repair all those relationships and
Right.
live the second half of his life a very, very happy man. Actually, if anybody goes to Algonquin Park and they stop at the visitor center, I forget if it's the east or west gate, there's a restaurant with a big fireplace and mantle, and there's a display there honoring Frank. And so there's a couple of my images are up there, and then there's his backpack and his fishing rod and axe and things like that.
Wow.
Yeah, really, really neat, man.
You must have been standing in the water with a light stand there or in another boat putting some light into his face there, taking that photo.
So I'm in the boat with Frank. I'm shooting with a Sigma 28 millimeter 1.4, shooting wide open.
Okay.
And camera left, there's another canoe with, trying to remember, I think there was just two people, one person maneuvering the canoe and then another person holding a great big softbox, basically a sail. It was windy out too. So
Yeah. Awesome.
and actually, if anybody wanted, there's a little clip in that film. It's called Legacy, and it's if you look up Sigma Legacy film or something like that, you'll find this film, and there's a bit of footage of me creating this exact shot. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, people that are initially getting into Flash, understanding, exposing for your background, how you want your background to look first, and then introduce your light in order to get the light set up with the right impact that you want. So 2 exposure triangles, one for your ambient light and one for your flash.
Mm-hmm.
And then this next image of...
This one is Leona Sky Grandmon that I mentioned earlier. She is the survivor of human trafficking.
Okay.
Yeah. So in this image, she's holding, I believe it's an eagle feather, and she's got her eyes closed, and she's just kind of looking down in this really calm, very serene kind of look.
Right.
I wanted to photograph her this way to show that she is at peace now.
Right.
Because in her early years, she went through hell. Her story is the most horrific story I've ever heard in my life. And now she's happily married, has adult kids. She's a well-respected Indigenous artist. She's Ojibwe. She's an advocate for human trafficking survivors. She's been able to deal with the things that have happened to her.
Right.
And I really wanted to show that. So
yeah,
she's an incredible woman.
Right. She's in your book as well, right?
She is, yeah.
And her story is in your book.
It is, yeah. So it's just amazing what she has lived through and where she's at now.
Right.
Unimaginable, actually. And so that's why I've shown her in this more peaceful way.
Nice to see that she is a survivor.
Mm-hmm. And we've kept in touch, actually. I mentioned earlier in our interview about the book readings
Right.
that I did at the literary festival. One of the ones that I shared was Leona's story.
Oh, awesome.
And I have an audio clip that is very emotional and talking about some of the things that happened to her without going into too much detail. And
right.
There was not a dry eye in the house. And
no, there would not be.
There was another author due to speak after me, and we actually had to take a break for everybody to collect themselves. It was very, very impactful. So,
well, awareness about this stuff is important, right?
I feel like I was going through life with blinders on, and I'm thankful that she shared her story with me, because now I know what things to watch out for, and
right.
How quickly something like this could happen to my own girls.
Yeah.
And so I'm thankful I'm a little bit educated now.
Yeah, human trafficking is a huge issue.
Yeah.
And there's lots of areas within our country that, sadly, it's a serious problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, awareness of this stuff is really important. There we have another guy with a beard, eh?
I get that comment a lot. Everybody seems to miss that I photograph women too.
Yeah.
So this man goes by the name of Stolly, and he's actually local here in Elora.
Okay.
The funny thing is, I mentioned earlier that there was only one instance I could think of where I actually photographed a person on the spot, and that was this man, Stolly.
Ah.
So in this image, you can see the signage behind him. It's Shepherd's Pub. That's actually his favorite pub.
Oh, okay.
And so it's moved now, but when it was in this location, you would actually go down a set of stairs to get into the pub.
Okay.
I knew that he frequented this spot, and I knew a little bit about him from asking people questions. I literally went down and caught him mid-beer and asked him if he'd come out front so I could photograph him. And somehow he said yes. He's not
cool.
the type of person that would normally say yes to that, but he did.
Awesome.
So this image really sticks with me, because when I photographed him, I asked Stolly, do you mind if I share this online? He basically said, sure, do whatever you want as long as you don't get me in trouble. He said it in much more colorful language, but
right.
So I shared it, and that evening, I looked on Facebook to see, what people were saying, and there was over 100 comments and over 100 shares at that point, which was a lot for me.
Yes.
And I'm reading through the comments, and there are people saying like how they remember this and that about Stolly, laughing about things he had done, commending him for certain things he's done in the community. And then there were two comments that just basically stopped me in my tracks. One of them said, "This is my dad. I haven't seen him in 35 years."
Wow.
The other one said, "This is my father. I haven't seen him in 37 years." So by this image being shared online, his kids in BC and Manitoba found him after 30 some odd years.
Wow, that's crazy, man.
Yeah. And he talked to them on the phone for the first time in all those years the next day. And he saw pictures of grandkids that I don't think he even knew he had.
Wow.
So people would describe him as a really gruff, kind of a grumpy old guy until you got to know him. And then he'd have some pretty dry humor for you.
Right.
Um, that day, and well, that week, basically, I swear he was walking on clouds around town. He was just in the best mood. So that was pretty neat to see.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, thanks so much for sharing those images with us, Wayne. That's awesome.
Oh, my pleasure.
So now a lot of your stuff is done on location. Imagine you spend some time in your local area because, there's probably lots of interesting people there, but you do travel around a little bit, especially doing some workshops and so on that you do. What kind of lighting equipment do you use? What cameras do you use? Lenses are your favorite.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you travel with your gear? How do you get it from one location to another?
So the lighting I use is from a company called Strobe Pro. They're in Calgary.
Okay.
People will know of Strobe Pro. It's Godox or...
Right. Rebranded like Flashpoint.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah.
From Adorama as a branded Godox brand.
Yeah.
Yeah, Strobe Pro, they're out in Calgary, right?
Yeah. So that's the equipment I use. Actually, both Dave Brosha and I use the same equipment, and we used it before we really got to know them, and we've since become basically sponsored by them.
Cool.
So that's the lighting we use. I personally like to use the... I can't think of the exact name of it. It's the 600 watt second light.
Right.
It's got the battery on the back of it, all self-contained. So it's great for location work. Ideally, I like to bring two lights with me so that I'm able to use two lights if I need. But most of my shots, I would say, are one light, followed closely by two lights. And then after that, there's the odd three light, and then it falls off from there. I don't use a ton of lights.
Right.
As far as camera, a lot of the images in my book were actually shot with the original 1DX Canon camera, but all my recent stuff has been done with the Canon R5, which I absolutely love. Lenses, if I'm shooting an event, I have, kind of the key RF zoom lenses.
Okay.
But my portraits, I'm still using the Sigma lenses. I used to be sponsored by Sigma. I'm not now, but I do still really enjoy their lenses. And the reason I've stuck with them in combination with an adapter is because when I do video work, I'll use the adapter that has the built-in ND filter.
Oh, okay.
And so then that allows me to, it's a variable ND. So that allows me to use the lenses for both without having a whole bunch of different NDs for different sizes of threads and things like that.
Right.
And I've always been happy with the image quality from the Sigmas.
Yeah.
So the key ones I use typically, I would say the 50 1.4 is one that I wouldn't want to be without.
Okay.
Closely followed by the 40 1.4.
Okay.
The 50 is a lot smaller, so if I'm traveling, I'll bring the 50. But if I have the luxury of having both, I'll usually lean towards the 40, just so I can include a little more of the environment in the shot.
Okay.
On the wide end, I'll use the 28 millimeter Sigma. That's a 1.4.
Okay.
On the longer end, I used to use the 105 1.4 Sigma.
Okay.
Which I sold, and I really regret that. So these days I'm using the 85 1.4 Sigma.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how do you actually travel with your equipment, your cameras and your lighting gear, getting it on a let's say a plane, for example? How do you actually maneuver all that with the worry of stuff being stolen?
What I always do is my carry-on is going to be my camera bag.
Right.
I don't put any cameras or lenses in my checked bags. So that's safe with me. And then you're always allowed like one personal item. That'll be my laptop bag.
Okay.
And in that laptop bag, I will have the batteries from whatever lights I bring.
Okay.
Because you're not allowed to have them on the light or with the light in your checked baggage.
Okay.
And they also have restrictions on how big the batteries can be. So the ones I use, the 600 watt second battery powered lights, those are okay to bring. So what I'll typically do is I'll take the battery off my lights, put it in my laptop bag, carry it on with me. My lights, I just wrap the lights in my clothes in my suitcase and just protect them that way.
Okay.
Usually bring 2 lights with me and reflector. I try not to bring a light stand if I can manage, because that is just a pain. And if I do have to bring one, I have a small one that I can fit in my luggage, but usually that'll put me over my weight limit.
And what about your soft boxes?
So for my particular style of shooting, usually I'll have one softbox and one, some people call them a reflector, like the metal reflector. Some people call them a can.
Okay.
I'll usually bring one of those and I'll put that in my suitcase as well. So usually my softbox, I go between, I have a 36-inch rapid box that's also from Strobe Pro.
Okay.
They now have the ones that fold down flat that are a lot easier to travel with.
Okay.
And if I'm looking for even softer light, sometimes I'll bring my old Elechrome, I think it's a 53-inch
Okay.
Octobox, and that barely fits in my luggage. And I almost never bring a tripod for portrait stuff.
Are you able to rent light stands or just buy one?
It all depends on the situation. If we're going to a workshop, a lot of times we'll have, some boots on the ground, so to speak.
Somebody can bring some light stands.
Yeah, people there that we can borrow some from or whatever. Or sometimes Strobe Pro sends them for us.
Okay.
Or worst case, I'll bring them and I'll just pay the extra cost if I have to.
Right. So just one more question. We just talked about gear. This is kind of jumping around a tiny little bit. 2 questions I wanted to ask. Do you have any formal training in writing, because you're writing stories and stuff for your books and so on? Or does that just come naturally to you? And 2, do you have any social work experience that helps with working with the people that you've been working with for some of your portraits?
The answer is no to both.
It's on-the-job training.
Yeah. As far as the writing goes, I used to write for a group I belong to online called Offbeat.
Okay.
It's an online community through a Facebook group. That's a really great community. Yeah, I used to write, I'm trying to remember now, I think it was once a month I'd write an article, and that was really great practice to sort of figure out if I could or could not write.
Okay.
I feel like I'm okay at it. I'm not 100% great, but I'm okay.
Right.
Yeah, so that's basically through practice.
Okay.
Is how I got to the point of a book. Oh, social work was the other one. No, but I've always been, I think, a good listener.
Right.
And I think that the biggest thing through all the interviews I did for my book that people commented on was it was like therapy, being able to just talk about their journey. And
Right.
It's been a big deal to a few of them to be able to just open up. And for me, on the receiving end of that, hearing people's deepest stories of resilience really does something to you. It's hard not to become kind of attached to these people and
Right.
have some kind of relationship with them after.
Right.
And to see pieces of yourself and loved ones in these stories and see the benefit of, in some cases, learning about things such as human trafficking.
Right.
That I hope to never have to learn firsthand.
Right.
Yeah.
To tell the story on that person's behalf, to be able to, increase the awareness of an issue that more people should be aware of. So I think that's awesome. When you're listening to these people, you do not want to miss a word that they have to say either, because you never know what they're going to reveal to you. And because, all they may have wanted for a long time is for somebody to listen to what they have to say.
Absolutely. Well, I have to say it's since doing the book and going through that, it was very heavy to have multiple stories going on at once and have all of that in my own head.
Right.
And the editing process actually happened during a lot of the lockdown, which was a dark enough time.
Right.
And
but you have 2 young girls too.
Yeah.
So that would have an impact, right?
Yeah. And to be 100% honest and transparent, that whole journey took me to a very dark place.
Yeah.
I started drinking more and more and more, like a lot of people did during the pandemic. And I found myself basically out of control at one point there.
Wow.
There were 2 people in the book. The main one was Frank Kuyak, who we talked about. He really inspired me. And throughout dealing with alcoholism and being in a really dark part of my life, I just kept thinking about Frank and the fact that he turned his life around. And eventually, the very first book that I read from beginning to end was How to Quit Drinking Without Willpower.
Oh, awesome.
And I have now been without a single drink in 10 or 11 months or something. And I don't care if I ever drink again. So it was my own therapy is what I'm trying to get at.
Right.
As much as it broke me down, it was a sense of therapy for me to hear all these people's stories.
Right. So you mentioned that when you go out and shoot these portraits, if the people want them, you give them prints. Do you print your own images? Do you have your own printer, or do you use a photo lab?
I don't print my own. For the longest time, I've been toying with the idea of getting a printer, but in the past, I've gotten a printer only for it to sit there and dry out, and I waste a bunch of money. So I think I print more now, but I still can't get past the fact that I wasted that printer, and I feel like it could happen again. So
yeah,
I send my stuff to Technicare in Edmonton.
Okay.
For things that are like, I would say like 8x10 and smaller.
Okay.
And for my exhibit, I printed that at a place called Smokestack Studios in Hamilton.
Okay.
Which I have to say, I went in and I saw the printer, and to me, it didn't look that much different than other big printers I've seen, but holy smokes, I'm spoiled now. That place, I've never seen a print look so dead on what I wanted it to look like.
Cool.
So thank goodness it did, because they were printed, I think 60 by 40, a lot of them.
Wow.
And they were huge. And thankfully, they looked as good as they could. So
do you have your monitor? Is it calibrated?
I used to, until I started working on a laptop because I was traveling and stuff. And I just started to trust what I see on this monitor. And honestly, it's never been far off.
Okay.
It's always been pretty good. Yeah. I used to do all the calibration stuff and have was it NEC, I think, monitor, like super wide gamut and everything.
Okay.
And I don't miss it at all. Yeah, that might go against what a lot of people say, but
well, I think it's more important if you're doing product photography, because colors have to be more smack on, and then you also have to, use something like a color checker to calibrate your camera too on the front end to do color profiles for your camera so that
right,
the products look actually correct. Then you need a meter to meter your light, so to make sure that your exposure is bang on, because if you change your exposure, then the color's going to change, So if you buy something from a website and it's a certain color red, it's got to be a certain color red when they receive the product, right?
Absolutely.
So doing more artistic or creative work, it's not as important. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not to say it may or may not help depending upon your situation.
Mm-hmm.
So what tips would you like to share on business in general, including advice about how to connect with clients before, during, and after working with them? So this would either be people that you're working with from a portrait, or you still do some corporate work, as I understand. Also, you run workshops or co-lead workshops, and also do mentoring or one-on-one as well, if you go to your website, which we'll talk about here in a minute. So in relationship to all that, are there any tips that you'd like to share?
That's always a hard question for me to answer as far as the business part of it goes. And the reason is that my business mostly is workshops, and it's kind of not so much a traditional photography sort of a deal. So A lot of your regular things don't apply, but some do. Regular things like making sure you get back to people quickly and, really cater to exactly what their needs are, especially in a learning environment.
Right.
If I'm setting up a session with somebody, whether it's a 4-day learning experience or a 2-hour one, I'll ask them ahead of time, what are the things they're trying to accomplish? What do they need help with? If they have any examples of images that they would like to be able to create or that they're drawn to,
Right.
I'll kind of use those as some inspiration for what I might show them how to do, things like that. Yeah, I don't know.
It's also understanding that everybody doesn't learn the same way.
Yeah,
So if you're a workshop leader or co-leader in a workshop and you're dealing with clients that are there taking your workshop, not every one of those clients learn in the same way.
yeah.
Are there any techniques that you use to be able to help people with various different learning abilities or inability?
I don't know if I have specific techniques per se, but through experience of working with different levels of experience throughout group workshops, you sort of get a feel for how to help people along and explain things in an easier way for them to grasp.
Right.
And on the flip side, you learn how to interact with people that might be working professionals and know their stuff, but they just want to sort of try to go in a slightly different direction or hone certain skills. So
Right.
I keep avoiding the whole business question because, to be honest, I am a terrible business person,
Right.
which I shouldn't be. But a- as far as business goes, I think the biggest thing for me is always just being honest. I'm honest almost to a fault.
Right.
I cannot tell a lie, and it's, I think, a good thing, but also a terrible thing at times.
Yeah.
I can be brutally honest at times.
Yeah. I think that's a really good trait. That's one of the most important things. And the top is honesty and expectation. Let the customer know what the expectation is. And if they have something different, to please convey, what they're looking for so that you're open to it as well. So,
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. Managing expectations when you do have a client.
yeah.
Yeah, and especially, I mean, I've got a couple of gigs I do that are corporate headshots, but it's more of a volume thing, which a lot of people probably don't know that I do.
Right.
In dealing with them in a way that I turn the images around quickly, I charge a fair price, just everything honest and on point, and don't leave anything not done well.
Right.
Be willing to bend over backwards to make things right for them. That's kind of my mentality.
Yeah.
If I do a shoot and somebody is not happy with it, I won't gripe about it. I'll just reshoot it
Right.
and make sure they're happy and understand why they weren't. And I don't know if that's ever happened, but that's what I would do.
Yeah. It's good advice. What's the one thing you wish you would have known before you started your photography journey?
I think something that I struggled with a lot in the beginning was I really got hung up on this idea of knowing what your style is and understanding where you fit in, and I would compare myself to everybody else.
Right.
What I've learned over time is that you just have to let things take its course. You're going to eventually one day realize, oh, that this is my style.
Right.
It's not really something that you just decide on how, what style you're going to shoot in. It just sort of organically happens.
Right.
Like I mentioned before, I've tried in the past to emulate different photographers, um, between Joel Grimes, Joe McNally, Dave Brosha, Joey Lawrence. If you take all those guys and try to emulate them and fail, that's what my work is. It's basically, I found something by failing, and I think that's pretty cool.
It's important to understand that failure is a good thing.
Yeah.
Because that's how you learn. If you went out and did something and boom, right off, then you're not necessarily learning anything or pushing yourself. And I think people need to understand that it's the same as anything. You're not born as a as an NBA basketball player or an NHL hockey player. You have to put in the work. Wayne Gretzky, for example, he started when he was 2 or 3 years old. And, that's how he got to where he got to. You can't just, sit back in a chair and wait until you're 14 or 15 years old and decide you're going to be an NHL hockey player, because it'll never happen.
Right.
So same as in photography, if you want to be a good photographer, you have to put in the work. You have to put in the time. You have to get out there with your camera.
One more point that I forgot to mention, which is really important, I think, is your attitude.
Yeah.
I don't know if you call it your attitude or your outlook. In the beginning, I would see other photographers as competition.
Right.
And I think a lot of people still have that mentality, and I don't think it does anybody any favors.
No.
A client will come to me if they like my work. If they don't like my work, they'll find someone's work that they do like. So why would I compete with another photographer when ultimately it's the client that's going to decide what it is they're drawn to?
Right.
Instead of being competitive, my approach, and I keep mentioning Dave, he's just a really close friend and I've learned a lot from him. Dave has the same attitude where he's just super kind and supportive. And he is the person that is very supportive in the whole community of photographers. There is no competition, and that's rubbed off on me. If a new photographer comes to town and moves to town here, I don't think, oh no, this person's going to take my business. I reach out to them and welcome them, ask if I can help in any way. I'll meet with them for a coffee and just chat and get to know them. And,
right.
One day I might be able to throw a job their way that maybe I don't have the expertise for, or the other way around, right?
Yep, exactly.
Everybody wins.
Right. Work as a community.
Yep.
So at your point in your career, do you continue to educate yourself? And do you think continuing education is important? And what do you look toward to or do now for education in photography?
I was pretty fortunate in the beginning that my circle of friends were people that I could learn a lot from.
Right.
That being said, yes, I do continue to educate myself kind of in a not in an official way. I didn't take any actual classes.
Right.
But it's like a way of life for me, photography.
Right.
It is life. So if there's something up and coming, I'm curious about it and I want to learn about it. So I'm always, on YouTube or interacting with people online or whatever,
right.
trying to learn what the latest things are. And I like to look at other people's work. At this point, I'm not looking at it to emulate it, but more just for little bits of inspiration, to take little bits and pieces from all over the place and hopefully bring them together in some way that it can help my own work.
Yeah. So the big question, where do you see yourself in 3 to 5 years?
Oh, 3 to 5 years. The last couple of years have been real turning points for me. I went from shooting work that I enjoyed and kind of putting it out there and teaching people to it progressively getting a lot more personal and having a lot more message along with it, as far as whether it be the different stories in my book or the project that I most recently did where there's a real message of connecting with your roots and
right.
looking after yourself and being vulnerable and things like that. So where I hope my work goes in the next few years is more down that route, where it's something that can hopefully inspire others to be vulnerable, to be in touch with themselves, to be true to themselves. Hopefully some level of inspiration for people.
Right.
Yeah. I know that my work, the exhibit that just came down, that was in Elora, is now going to an office in Toronto, and it's actually going to be used. It's going to be set up again as a full exhibit with the film and everything, and it's actually going to be used as a teaching tool for people from the health industry, from hospitals in particular.
Oh, cool.
So all the main hospitals in Toronto, the CEOs and head surgeons and various top people in the hospitals will come in small groups, and I will share my experience with them through my exhibition being housed there. And so that's right in line with where I'm hoping things continue to go, where it serves as some sort of educational thing or inspirational thing, and it's much deeper than simple portraits.
Yeah. Turns out to be bigger than you thought it would be.
Yeah.
More meaningful work.
Yeah. I hope it just keeps going that way.
Cool. What's one piece of advice you would like to share with a beginner to photography and to starting a photography business?
I would say a big one is don't go broke trying to do it. Know your budget.
Right.
And purchase things within that budget.
Right.
Light is light. You don't have to have the top of the line equipment. I used to be an Elinchrom snob.
Okay.
I would only use Elinchrom lights, and they were super expensive. And then I was introduced to Strobe Pro, and I am absolutely happy with the quality I get from those lights at a fraction of the cost.
Right.
And so that's just one example. I guess the Sigma lenses is another example. I could be all decked out with RF glass and be broke,
Right.
but nobody would know the difference, to be honest,
Right.
that I use less expensive Sigma glass. So I think that's a real big one because I did not follow that advice early on.
Right. And any advice about starting a photography business or turning your hobby into a business?
Yeah, I think personally, I think up to a point, it's a mistake to just dive into it. I think it's important to try to maintain a balance with a regular income, build the business up, do weekend jobs, whatever. Eventually, you will get to a point where you just can't manage to do both and you have to make a decision, and that's a good thing.
Right.
Thankfully, I was able to do that. So, yeah, I think that would be a good piece of advice.
Yeah, I think that's awesome advice. I'm just going to share my screen again here, and we can talk about where you can be found on the internet. So you have your website, Facebook, and Instagram. Maybe just let the folks know what they can find at each one of those if they go to those links.
Yeah, so first, my website, you'll find information there as to obviously how to reach me, what kind of services I offer, all that stuff, and all my various portfolios. So you can find that at WayneSimpsonPhotography.com. If you prefer to just email me, info@WayneSimpsonPhotography.com. It's pretty simple. Facebook, I've got my Wayne Simpson Photography page and then my own personal page. To be honest, they're almost the same. Everything I share on my business page, I'll just share it on my personal page because, as I mentioned, photography is my life. So
Right.
Instagram, my handle is Wayne Simpson Photo. On there, it's a much more curated version. It's my actual work that I'm proud of. And as I do it, it'll show up there.
Right.
So that being said, the work from my exhibition does not really show up anywhere because, as I mentioned earlier, I'm trying to hold that a little bit tight until I see if another gallery will take it.
Right.
But the shot that I've shared here of Ryan in front of the sweat lodge is actually from the exhibition.
Okay. Folks may be interested in looking at the Adorama TV video. It's called Through the Lens. It's actually quite an interesting series. So once you're finished watching the one about Wayne Simpson, an excellent done video. And there's lots of other artists in that series called Through the Lens from Adorama TV. So folks there might want to take a look at that. If anyone is interested as well, a little more about Wayne's book, Resilient, a lot of it talked about on Rising Laterally podcast, which is out there on YouTube as well. So if you take a look at that, I think you'll find that quite interesting too. So Wayne, I'd like to thank you so much for being on the podcast and really appreciate you being here. And it's been a great conversation.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for dropping by and listening to the You Can Learn Photography podcast. If you're interested in being on the show, please contact us by visiting the contact page on youcanlearnphotography.ca. We hope this show provides some inspiration and allows you to get to know some of the fellow photographers in Canada. So until next time, enjoy your photography and keep shooting.